Hi guys, so I'm 50% of the way through The Shining, which is my first ever Stephen King novel, and I swear if this kid dies, we riot, like we riot at dawn. He's gonna die. I'm pretty sure he's gonna die, so I'm a little anxious. But let me try to kind of gather my composure here and provide a brief summary of what I'm gonna be going over in this video regarding The Shining. So hope you'll stick around. Let's get started. All right, so in terms of previous knowledge for Stephen King, I haven't read any of his works, and I know that a lot of his works have also been translated to particularly popular films and TV series, but I've actually never seen any of those either. All I know is some of the more famous titles. I know that The Shining is one of those, and I know that the film for that stars Jack Nicholson was very popular, and I do have like an image in my head of Jack Nicholson with like the crazy eyes. And that's literally like the only context I had for jumping into this novel. I knew zero about the plot. Of course, I know that it's like horror suspense, that it's within that genre. I know that Stephen King is an incredibly prominent contemporary writer who has had a huge influence in that particular genre and just like in contemporary literature in general. And to some degree in cinema as well, because again, so many of his works have been translated into film. So that's what little I know. And with that, let's move on to our general summary of the first half of the novel. Okay, so there's this guy, Jack, who is a recovering alcoholic, and he loses his temper a lot when he's drunk. And one time, his son, who's this like smart, sweet little cinnamon roll of a 5-year-old, when he's even younger than that, he trashes one of the rooms and spills some beer on this guy's manuscript for a play. He walks in drunk and he's just like incensed. He yanks the boy's arm hard enough to break it. He doesn't sprain it or dislocate his shoulder, he like breaks his arm. But we learn that he is a writer. He has been writing this play that he's been unable to complete. We don't know if he is any good at writing, if he sucks at writing. We just know that he kind of like sucks as a person. That was before. Things are better now because he stopped drinking because he and his like drinking buddy, fellow alcoholic, were driving around drunk one day and crashed into a bike. And that bike mysteriously had no human on it. We don't know if it actually did or if they just kind of convinced themselves that there was nobody there. The fact that they almost kill a supposedly non-existing human that could have been on that bike freaks them out sufficiently to allow them to kind of finally kick the drinking habit. And they continue to be friends and to kind of support each other in their sobriety after this. At this point is when Wendy, his wife, was about to bring up the topic of divorce, and she had already set her mind to it. Just in that moment, things start to improve, and so the conversation never ends up coming up. But also there's this whole other incident where Jack beats a student up.
So he's a professor at this school, and this kid was like on this debate team that he was running, and he kicked him off the debate team because the kid had a stutter. So this kid is pissed, he wants revenge, and he slashes his tires outside the school. Jack catches him slashing the tires. Okay, clearly you would get angry about that, and that is a bad thing that would require some repercussions.
But getting beat to a pulp by your professor is not one of them. So that is his reaction in that moment. Again, his temper flares up. And what's important to note is that this is after he has already become sober. So you can't really blame the alcohol this time. But this happens and he gets fired from his job. And so his friend Al, the also former alcoholic, actually ends up helping him to find a temporary job. He's going to be staying with his family for the entire winter off season at this place called the Overlook Hotel, which is a beautiful kind of historic hotel in the mountains of Colorado. And it closes completely for the entire winter. And they need to have some kind of caretaker there just to watch over the property and do some basic tasks. So he's just gonna fix up the roof and trim the topiary. And make sure to adjust this boiler that's down in the basement multiple times a day. And the boiler itself is kind of like this ominous presence in the story that makes noise and almost kind of like breathes, and it just sort of portends bad things to come. But now I'm venturing into analysis, so let's kind of regroup here. He moves into the Overlook with his wife and his kids so that he can obviously make some money and also reconnect with his family while they're kind of isolated up there, and write his damn play, and everything's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. Even though once it starts snowing, they're gonna be stuck there with like no working phone and an evil boiler and probably ghosts and stuff, but everyone is gonna be fine. Oh, and the family that stayed there last winter, they're all dead because the guy killed his wife and 2 daughters and then unalived himself, and we're going to totally ignore that like blazing red flag and do this anyway because everything is going to be fine. All right, so then the other thing is that this perfect little 5-year-old boy who absolutely deserves none of this nonsense, he has what we come to call the Shining, title of the book, and it was actually pretty exciting for me to see the chapter called The Shining and to have it explained to me, because I did always wonder like what that was a reference to, since the title is so like ever present in the culture, but I had never actually read the book or seen the film. Okay, so Danny has this invisible friend named Tony who shows him things when Danny's able to like concentrate hard enough. And at first, these are nice things, and then they become increasingly scary things, particularly to do with what's coming up with the Overlook Hotel that they're going to be moving into. So at first, we're thinking, oh no, this poor baby has like schizophrenia, right? But it can't be that, because Tony shows him things that are true and also things that do end up actually occurring in the future. And these are things that there was no other practical way for Danny to have learned. He also can read people's minds and emotions really well. He's like telepathic. He listens to his mom and dad's minds all the time. And so he really knows like the inner world and the inner struggle of his parents without really having like the adult mentality to be able to fully understand the details and the mechanics behind everything. So it's like a really interesting perspective. But he, for instance, knows that like the word divorce is in the consciousness of both of his parents all of the time. And he also knows when it ceases to be in their consciousness. And this is even though neither of the parents have ever brought up the word divorce or the idea of separating to him, nor have they spoken even to each other about it. It's just been something that they've been thinking about. Back to the visions, Tony starts to show Danny these like really scary images and scenes of like things that are going to happen at the Overlook Hotel. But Danny doesn't really say anything to his parents because A, they don't quite understand and are fearful of when he has these premonitions. They're like medically concerned for him, obviously. Also, he really knows that his dad needs this job, that he needs to be able to finish writing his play, and that he needs this in order to not do the bad thing, which is what he calls drinking in his mind, and that's what's going to avoid the big scary divorce. Basically, like this 5-year-old kid is holding himself responsible for regulating his parents' emotions, which is really too much of a burden for this child. So anyway, he says nothing and banks on the fact that Tony is not always right about what's going to happen. So he tries to be optimistic about it and heads over with them to the Overlook Hotel. And it should be noted that a lot of those scary scenes, Danny recognizes the voice. We understand that voice to be the voice of his father. So we are expecting Jack to kind of take a turn for the worse, even though at this particular stage, he has gotten a lot better. I haven't talked too much about the mother, Wendy, and she's basically like a really kind, emotionally intelligent person whose only major flaw is loving this man too much to have left him in time before things really like hit the fan. She is also like very perceptive about her son, and she comes to believe in
his like abilities, even though she doesn't quite understand them, and she tries to have a frank conversation with him about it at one point, and they're already at the hotel, and she knows that there's something about the place that is just like not sitting right with her, and she assumes that Danny is also scared, and so she does ask him like, do you want to leave? If you want to leave, we will leave, you and I and your dad can finish on his own. And he seems excited about the prospect until he learns that they would have to go to his grandmother's house because she has nowhere else to stay, she can't afford to, and he's more scared of that than of staying at the Overlook Hotel, because again,
He can read people's minds, and every time he's around his grandmother, what he hears over and over again is her thinking, I should have custody of this kid. And for him, there's nothing scarier than that. Once the whole family's there, the outlook seems sunny at first, but pretty quickly the Overlook Hotel starts to have this like unsettling effect on our villain. I don't know that I'm supposed to think of him as our villain, but that's how I think of him. He is not drinking because there is no alcohol at all on the property, so he has no access to alcohol. However, he is experiencing all of like the tics and symptoms that he used to have when he was drinking. And crucially, that temper is making an occasional appearance, more and more so as the plot continues to develop. Meanwhile, poor Danny is trying to manage all of these nightmares and scary visions that he's having, and he's trying to just kind of like deal with all of that internally. Backtracking just a little bit, when they first arrive at the hotel, this is the last day that all of the employees are still there. And so they meet the cook, who gives them sort of a tour of the kitchen. And it turns out that he's a telepath as well. Not as strong of a telepath as Danny is, but they kind of recognize each other and they're able to have a conversation inside their heads a little bit. And so then he ends up setting him aside and having a private conversation with him in his car. He tells him of some of these kind of scary things in the hotel and kind of just tries to calm his fears a little bit by letting him know that these images that he sees, that they're just pictures. They probably, keyword, probably can't hurt him, and that he just needs to like look away, and when he looks back, it should be gone. The one thing he does warn about, however, is entering room 217. Something horrific happened there, makes him promise not to enter room 217. And of course, he promises not to enter room 217 and then totally enters room 217. And that is precisely the last chapter that I read. After that point, we begin part 4, which is about 50% of the way through the novel. This concludes our chaotic summary over here, but I will say that it was really hard for me at that point not to continue reading for the sake of this video, because I did want to kind of do a halfway through situation before I finished it off. But it's probably best that I couldn't continue reading because it was late at night and I had to play like a little sleep guided meditation thing to try to get it out of my head so that it wouldn't like feed into my dreams and have them become nightmares. So thank you, YouTube, for forcing me to stop myself and censor myself at that stage. All right, so moving on to my first impressions overall. Number one is that Stephen King is doing a really good job of building suspense, which obviously, like as expected, that's the whole point of most of his works from my understanding. So I was expecting that to be the case. And yes, some of it is like the plot development itself and the pacing, but I think a lot of it also has to do with the characters themselves and the way that they come across on the page. He does a great job of allowing his readers to inhabit the psyche of his characters, and we get basically 3 perspectives: the 3 family members, the dad, the mom, and the son. These perspectives are represented as fairly neutral without any editorializing on the part of the narrator regarding the characters' actions, behaviors, motivations, or their reasoning. And so that really allows us as the reader to kind of judge the characters for ourselves. So one thing I noticed is that Stephen King uses a lot of what we would call free indirect discourse or free indirect speech. This is something that like Jane Austen was really famous for utilizing a lot. For those of you unfamiliar with that particular term, it basically just means that the point of view is in the third person, but the internal thoughts are not in the voice of the narrator. They're in the voice of the characters themselves. So just as an example, the very first sentence in chapter 1 reads as follows. Jack Torrance thought, officious little bleep. This is my second video. I don't know what I'm allowed to say on YouTube yet, so I'm just not going to risk it. Now, while this isn't dialogue and it's not in the first person, it is taking us like directly into Jack's mind. So we get the info technically in the third person, but coming from the character's own perspective. And that basically allows us to feel like we're inside the character's psyche. It's a little bit more intimate, and we can judge for ourselves whether we agree with their thinking, disagree, if we feel uncomfortable about it, right? So, like, for instance, are this person's gripes valid? Is this person in denial, right? Are they blaming others for their own actions? Are they trying to like delude themselves in some way? These are questions I constantly had in my head when I was reading Jack's perspective in particular. But the point is that the narrator doesn't tell us, like we get to decide. So I find the writing style overall to be pretty accessible. It's at times like intentionally informal. Again, we are kind of living inside these characters' heads. And what I also really like is that these three different perspectives from the main characters do feel fairly distinct from one another, which I think is important. Another thing I'd like to note is the really frequent use of parentheses or like parentheticals. I did actually look up if this is something that Stephen King does a lot of generally, or if it's just within this novel. And from what I researched, you can tell me if that's incorrect, but it seems that it is something he employs in other works of his. And it's not the first time that I've seen authors use parentheses in this way, but I don't think I've ever seen someone use it in this way as often as Stephen King seems to do. So I think that that's kind of unique to him. I could be wrong. There's a ton of authors out there that I've never read, but based on what I have read so far, it comes across as unique. So these parentheses, they can be used like your typical parenthetical as like an aside, but often they also denote like intrusive thoughts that the character is having, which builds the suspense as well within the novel. So here's one example. We see towards the bottom of the page, it was only lately that Daddy had begun to have trouble since he found those papers. This inhuman place makes human monsters. This particular phrase comes up a lot in the first half of this novel, and I'm sure will be coming up again in the latter half. And that particular chapter is in Danny's perspective. He's sounding like himself up until the point that you see the parenthetical. And that is definitely not the way that he would think. It seems to be a thought that's coming from outside himself and is just like intruding upon his own thought process and obviously providing some foreshadowing there. Often these asides interrupt a sentence, in which case the parentheses will be indented and the continuation of the sentence will also be indented, as you can see here in this passage. So that's enough about the writing style. I also just wanted to point out that I really appreciate all of the colorful side characters that we get in this story. Some of them likable, some of them unlikable. But my favorite is the cook, who again is like the fellow telepath and has a chat with Danny. And he kind of like half jokingly invites Danny to spend the winter with him in Florida rather than staying in the hotel. And I, not jokingly at all, kind of wish that he had just kidnapped him so that he could be away from this mess. But can we please take a moment to appreciate Watson, who is the hotel caretaker during the part of the year when there are other humans in the hotel, because he's not an idiot, and he is one of the most foul-mouthed characters that I have ever come across in a book. Here are some of his greatest hits. After that brief comic relief, let's move on to my deep thoughts. When I first started reading the novel, I was surprised by the writing style because it's not what I was expecting Stephen King's writing to sound like, until it started to sound like a familiar story. And then I realized that it was actually just an excerpt from Edgar Allan Poe's famous short story, The Masque of the Red Death. So once I finished the first half of the novel. The next day I went ahead and reread The Mask of the Red Death because I wanted to get a sense or a deeper sense of why Stephen King was referring to this story within The Shining. And that opening is not the only place where we get kind of like a nod to The Mask of the Red Death. So another like super quick summary of this short story. If you don't want spoilers, you can skip ahead to the next timestamp. But in The Mask of the Red Death, you have this disease, this like pestilence, call it the plague, call it COVID, call it what you will, and it's just kind of killing everybody off. And so this monarch, Prince Prospero, decides that he is going to invite 1,000 of his really rich royal buddies to hang out and quarantine with him in his grand palace, where they can be completely shielded from the pestilence that's out there. They are going to eat, drink, dance, and be merry, and poor people be damned. So this one night they're having this like wonderful masquerade, and there's this one room that has a large ebony clock, and it's a black velvet room, and nobody goes in there because they're just kind of like weirded out by that room a little bit. And that clock chimes every hour on the hour, and when it does, everybody kind of like stops in their tracks. Like the music stops playing, people stop dancing, and everyone has this kind of like unsettling feeling that comes over them. But as soon as it stops chiming, they're like, oh my gosh, we're so silly. Like, let's keep dancing. And so then they continue to have a great time until the next hour rolls around and it starts chiming again. So this happens throughout the entire evening. And then by the time that it's midnight, something has shifted. Suddenly there's like this masked figure, uninvited, that comes into the crowd. The mask that he's wearing and just kind of generally his overall presence appears as though it were like a corpse of somebody who has died of the pestilence. So it's kind of like mocking the guests that are there. The king is incensed. He's like, how did this guy get in? How dare he come here and like dress up that way, trying to scare everybody? And he demands that he be captured and punished. But everybody is kind of frozen in fear, so nobody does anything, nobody moves. And eventually the prince lunges himself towards this masked figure and with a knife is attempting to kill him. But once the masked figure kind of turns around, they're at close quarters, Prince Prospero just kind of collapses on the floor and dies. At this point, now everybody is freaked out enough to kind of like in mass hysteria try to go straight to this guy. Once they get to him, he's basically like intangible, not corporeal. And at that point is when you realize that he's not an actual person, but rather the Red Death itself. So he's kind of like a personification of the pestilence. Slowly but surely, one by one, all of these people die as well. So the Red Death comes for them. No one can cheat death. So how might this tie into The Shining? What I'm seeing overall here is this theme or idea of attempting to escape the dangers out there of the world, but you cannot escape those. Like, good morning. So my camera went out of focus yesterday as I was filming and really never recovered until I got smart enough to turn on a lamp. So I only discovered that after the fact, and at that point it was too late to keep filming. I'm off to work in a minute, so I'm trying to get this in real quick, but let's go over everything that I basically had to delete. Jack can't escape the dangers of the world out there. His inner demons, such as the alcoholism, for example, follow him around into the Overlook. But in the case of The Mask of the Red Death, this is an unsuccessful attempt, and I'm assuming that in The Shining it's going to probably be also an unsuccessful attempt. The clock is also an interesting symbol here. People keep trying to outrun time, both in the story and in life, but you cannot stop time, you cannot turn back time. It always catches up with you. And I kind of see the boiler as like a ticking time bomb in this property as well. You're not supposed to ignore the boiler, and I feel like at some point the boiler is going to get ignored. I also wanted to bring up Alice in Wonderland because we get multiple references to that as well in The Shining, such as the idea of the rabbit hole and the Queen of Hearts with her mallet. In both stories, you get this sense of the unreal or absurd, like you've fallen into this alternate alienating, surreal universe that you don't really know how to escape from, but at the same time, you're sort of morosely drawn to. In The Shining, that wonderland is the hotel itself, but at the same time, I feel like it's more of an internal world. Like that descent into the rabbit hole is really a descent into madness. It's a mental descent. And then last major item here is the wasp nest, because I definitely feel like that's highly symbolic throughout this first half of the novel, and I'm expecting the idea of the wasps to come back into play, if not the wasps themselves. Jack is really vindictive when he gets stung. He tries to poison spray the entire nest and kill off all of the wasps. I need my laptop for a quote. In this moment, from Jack's perspective, we get this. He went down the ladder to get the bug bomb. They would pay for stinging him. But then he gives his son the supposedly now empty wasp nest to just like have as a cool thing in his room. And the wasps in the middle of the night resurface in the room and attack Danny in droves. Thankfully, he survives this. He's not allergic to wasps, but he is probably psychologically scarred by this, especially since it meshes together with all of these nightmares and fears that he already has about the Overlook. Now, Jack takes his fury out on the bug bomb company, saying that he had followed the instructions to the T and that the product didn't work, and he is dissuaded from actually pursuing this lawsuit because there's no way for him to prove that he actually used the product correctly. But what's interesting about this is that he is looking for something to blame when ultimately he is the one who suggested that Danny keep that wasp nest in his bedroom. And the mother, Wendy, she expressed a lot of concern about it and kept asking, are we sure that there's no wasps left? Are we sure? So there's this pattern with Jack of like deflecting blame onto others and feeling like the universe is conspiring against him. In a broader sense, the wasps obviously can represent this idea that the hotel itself is kind of just a wasp nest waiting to be rattled just a little bit in order to attack. That covers the main points of analysis that were kind of rattling around in my head, but I'd also like to share some questions that I have, since obviously I haven't finished the novel yet. So these are some questions that I hope get answered in the second half of the novel. So is the hotel actually making Jack worse, or is it just kind of revealing who he really is deep down? I had mentioned in the past how we can't really blame alcohol for all of the instances of violence that come up. One of those key instances is when he beats up his student, and I've got another quote for you. And he had not hated George Hatfield. He was sure of that. He had not acted, but had been acted upon. So again, it's the world conspiring against him. He doesn't feel like he himself is responsible for that action. It's just like the circumstances of his life. Another one of my questions pertains to this quote. This inhuman place makes human monsters. We see this phrase repeated over and over again throughout the novel, and I think that we're starting to see even Danny be affected by this place. At one point, he uses language in his mind that is the kind of language his dad would use. But for the most part, Jack is the one most affected. And I wonder why that is. I wonder if because of his character or because of his past trauma or experiences, he is just kind of more susceptible to those negative influences of the Overlook. And ultimately, is it really the hotel that's exerting this kind of influence on him, or is it the isolation itself? My final question is, what on earth is red rum? I keep trying to figure that one out and trying to unlock clues from the first half of the novel, but I can't come to any particular conclusion. The only thing I'm thinking of is the reference to rum or alcohol, but I think that's kind of too easy. I also wonder if the word red in Red Rum has some tie-in with the Red Death from Edgar Allan Poe. It just so happens to have a little Poe figurine right here. I don't know if you can see him, but I thought I'd share him with you since we are discussing one of his short stories. But let's move on. And finally, we're at the point where I actually thought to turn a lamp on and the camera lens came back into focus. So I will hand this off to me from yesterday. Okay, I have turned on a little lamp because it is getting pretty dark at this point, and we're on to my final predictions. So number one, that boiler is going to blow up. I would be really surprised if the boiler doesn't blow up. But, maybe that prediction will blow up in my face. I just came up with that joke right now, and I really regret it. Okay, next up, definitely expecting deaths. I'm expecting the mother and father to both die. I am really hoping that the little boy can survive this, perhaps saved by the cook if he makes a quick appearance here at the end. But I mean, it wouldn't surprise me at all if everybody died. The family from last winter, everybody died, right? So I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but definitely some death is going to occur. I do think that the cook is going to make a reappearance at some point, and I think that obviously we're going to be seeing a lot of these visions that Danny has been having come to life, right? Like we're going to see that bloody mallet at some point, and all of the scary quotes that we keep hearing in Danny's mind will actually be verbalized in reality by his father once he's fully descended into madness. I also expect there to be some kind of scene in which Jack is chasing Danny around this hotel. I don't think that we're going to be left with a clear-cut ending that like reveals the grand message of this novel. On the contrary, I think that I'm going to be left with this like unsettling feeling of uncertainty that I'm going to have to grapple with. But I do hope that Watson comes back and says something completely ridiculous to cut the tension a little bit, after everybody has died. All right, so it's on to the second half, which I hope to finish by Halloween. I'm filming this October 27th. So hopefully in the next few days, I'll be able to finish the novel and then take a break from self-induced anxiety. But if anybody's watching, this is like a very new channel, but if you're watching and you would like to see a part 2 of how I felt about the second half of the novel, just let me know down below. And either way, please comment, let me know if this is a particular favorite of yours by Stephen King, if you have any other Stephen King favorites that you would recommend. And should I be scared for what's to come in the second half, but please no spoilers. All right, thank you so much for joining me. Bye-bye.